So, Professor Torre, thank you so much for this interview. And I wanted to start by asking you who and what made you who you are today.
Well, that could take all day just to try to answer, but very quickly I would say that some of the strongest influences on my life is my mother, who was an illiterate woman, but had a very earthy, common wisdom that helped shape the way I think and the way I even do my analysis today. My father is the second person who was highly influential when we grew up very poor, and I was a straight D F student.
Wow.
And one day he came to me and showed me his callous hands and basically said, unless I start getting good grades, I'll have hands like his. And that highly influenced me to really spend my time thinking about working with my brains instead of my hands. And probably the third person that highly influenced me, and I consider my intellectual mentor, is Jose Marti, whose hunger and thirst for liberation and for justice pretty much guides my thinking today.
hmm and how would you describe yourself? Who you are and what you do?
I probably would just call myself a scholar activist. The emphasis is on the scholar. That's what I do. I mean, I do critical analysis, but also an activist because it is the work I do within the community. It's the work that I do trying to bring more justice that influences my and really is the foundation of my scholarship. So in true liberation theology fashion, it is the scholarship that becomes the reflection of all the second act, while the praxis, the activism, becomes the foundational first act.
I see. Here at the Wabash, you described your spiritual life or your religiosity as a Southern Baptist Catholic Santeria. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, many Latinos, I say many, a great number of Latinos, have this hybrid existence. In other words, we don't really fit in one place. The term napanta, the in-between place, is where we find ourselves. So this hybridity obviously influences my spirituality. I was born in a Catholic home. I grew up as a Catholic. I was baptized, communion, and confirmation. And that's part of who I am, and the social teachings of the church highly influences me. So in my writings, I'm very comfortable quoting the popes and the encyclicals. But I also became a Southern Baptist at one point in my life. I walked down the aisle, gave my life to Jesus, and it was at a Southern Baptist church. And that hunger for evangelizing, of sharing good news, and this I'm not mean by evangelizing and showing and making you think and believe the same doctrines I think and believe in, but rather the good news that because we are created in the image of the Creator, we have worth and dignity. And that's a very strong part of who I am as well. And thirdly, my parents may have been Catholics by day, but at night they were Santeros. So I grew up in a home of Santeria, in where I am the child, el hijo de Eregua, the child of Eregua, which is the trickster. And that highly influences my way of thinking, and that highly influences my scholarship. So rather than choosing between these three different diverse spirituality, I'm embracing all three, and therefore I consider myself a ordained Southern Baptist minister who's a Catholic and who has strong leanings in Santeria.
Right. So what is theology and what is ethics, if you could describe both, and how they work together?
Okay. Well, and here I'll probably show my bias. I mean, I happen to believe ethics is the queen of the disciplines, and the reason is if I accept that paradigm I mentioned earlier, that praxis is a second act. I mean, sorry, that praxis is the first act and reflection is the second act. Then the first act is ethics. What do I do? You know, what should be done? And then the theology becomes the reflection of what I did. So as I'm feeding the hungry, theology begins to answer the questions as to where is God and what is the character of God in a hungry world. But it's not until I actually begin that ethical impulse to do the work of God that I can then begin to imagine to answer the second question of who is God. So in that way, there's a strong connection between the two. Obviously, I reject the idea that we begin with theology, and then based on our theology, that will tell us what to do. I flip that on its head.
Right. And so where do you start?
Well, I begin with praxis, and the starting point becomes the observation. In other words, I see the world for what the world is. I see the oppression that exists. So observing, seeing becomes that first act. And then as I get involved in a hurting, hungry, thirsty world, that's when I begin to discover where God is in all this.
Uh-huh. Some of the ethicists will say that we don't need to start with justice. That we just need to start where the testimony or the where the people is in regards to their faith. So what do you have to say about that?
I would say that they're wrong. I would say that you have to begin with justice. That's the whole purpose of ethics. That's the whole purpose of our being. Maybe if I wasn't part of a community that is oppressed or marginalized or disenfranchised, I could then have the luxury of not putting any emphasis on justice and instead put my emphasis on intellectual ivory tower pursuits.
Right, right. And so as you start with justice, as you keep your eyes all around the world, what are the most pressing issues of our times that you see today that Christians need to be not only aware of but engaged with?
There's so many. Obviously, whenever there's a group that's oppressed, whenever there's a group that is kept out, whenever there's a group that is not accepted in their full humanity, I think Christians have a moral obligation to stand in solidarity, even if that group is not Christian. That is the least of the concerns. So, for example, I'm very concerned in this country with the issue of the undocumented, who don't even have voice and live in the shadows of this government, and the way that they're being treated and the way they are dying in the deserts. Christians need to be walking those desert migrant trails with them. I'm very concerned with the LGBT community. People who are discriminated against, who cannot participate in their full humanity just because God created them with certain sexual orientations. So this is also a major concern. I believe one of the major concerns Christians must speak out against is the way we are destroying Mother Earth, the way we are destroying the resources and polluting this continent, the way we're destroying the rainforests and contributing to global warming. Because quite frankly, there's not a plan B, there's not another Earth that we can go to. And if this Earth and this land is destroyed, then there's no one to do justice for anymore. So off the top of my head, those are the three major concerns that I see Christians have been silent in, and yet need to have voice. They need to be the voice for those who may not have voice.
So what would you say, what would be your proposal for a just immigration policy in the US?
I have no idea. And I say that because the actions of this government over the last 100 years in gunboat diplomacy, in going into other countries to take by force at times their natural resources or their cheap labor. As we build roads into those other countries to take these resources and cheap labor, why should we be surprised that those same people are taking those same roads, following everything that has been stolen from them? So this immigration problem that we have has begun back when Teddy Roosevelt begins gunboat diplomacy. This is a problem that's 100 years in the making. So to come up with an answer that's going to fix it overnight is almost impossible. But at the very least, we should be thinking about, not splitting up families. At the very least, we shouldn't be sending women and children across the border at 3 in the morning, returning them into very dangerous border towns when all the services are closed.
Right.
At the very least, when they're in our prisons, we shouldn't be denying them water and food and medical attentions. I mean, these are just acts of humanity that we should begin there. But as far as what an overall policy is, it may take 100 years before we fix it. And maybe the question we should be asking is not so much, should we let them come, or what do we do with them once they're here? Maybe the question is, after a century of neocolonialism, what restitution must we provide as Christians for all that we have stolen from these people for the last century?
Right.